Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C.'s Author Series event with Dr. Dani Rodrick. Tonight we're going to turn to economics and globalization, and our guest is the author of the new book, Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy. In it, he argues that nations cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, self-determination, and economic globalization. If we want to preserve democracy, we have to choose between national sovereignty and globalization. If we want to preserve the nation state, we have to choose between keeping democracy and deepening globalization. And if we want to push for fuller globalization, we must sacrifice either the democratic political process or the nation state. We can have any two in combination, but we cannot have all three. Dr. Rodrick is the Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and he has previously also taught at Columbia University. He has lectured on political economy and development across the globe and published numerous books, including One Economy, Many Recipes, Globalization, Institutions, and Economic Conflict, Integrating the Americas, and Has Globalization Gone Too Far? He is routinely included on all of the top 100 economists lists, and tonight he will take your questions once he has concluded his remarks. If you have a question, please come up to this microphone to ask it and identify yourself when you do so. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dani Rodrick.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out. This is an issue on which economists never stop writing, economics of globalization and the world economy, but I think I'm trying to do something that's a little bit different, which is try to bring out something that economists very rarely write about, which is democracy. Bring the utility and value of democracy and the way that we think about how to structure globalization to the forefront of the discussion. The book's title is The Globalization Paradox, so you may wonder, what does the paradox refer to? There's actually several paradoxes in the book. Maybe the one that I would stress at the outset is the idea that the best kind of globalization, the healthiest globalization, the one that is likely to work the best, actually is the globalization that we don't push beyond its natural limits. So the kind of economic globalization that's going to work best is a somewhat limited kind of globalization. And all kinds of implications follow from that in the way that what we should be talking about in the areas of international trade, international finance, international migration, and so forth. The point here is that there needs to be a very delicate balance between the power of the nation state and the reach of markets worldwide. And that if we go too far in either of the two directions, we end up making rather difficult mistakes. If you push the nation state too far, emphasize the primacy of nation state over global markets too much, then we get a lot of protectionism and we deprive ourselves of many of the benefits of economic globalization. On the other hand, we go too much in the other direction. We push economic globalization way too much at the expense of the prerogatives or the policy space that nation states have. Then we run into problems of lack of legitimacy for global economic institutions, problems of economic instability, problems of financial crises, and many other issues, many other ills of economic globalization that we're actually familiar with. And of course, the big question is, how do we think about where is the right balance? How are we going to draw this fine line, the fine balance between where the nation state stops and global markets rule? Where does the global markets stop and nation states rule? And a lot of the discussion in the book is actually about trying to think through in various parts of the world economy, in trade, in finance, in global development, where that balance ought to be. And I think equally importantly, who should draw that balance? And here I really emphasize that it's not sort of technocratic forces, economists in their role as Platonic guardians who ought to be doing this, but that this should be very much a province of democratic discussion and deliberation. And so this is the sense in which I bring out the role of democracy to the forefront. There are three key ideas in the book that I want to start out with. These may seem a bit abstract and beyond sort of everyday reality, but I want to start out with these because these are the ideas that really frame the more substantive, practical discussion in the book that I think is important to underscore. The first idea is a corollary to a very well-known dictum from Adam Smith. And Adam Smith wrote, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. That is, how far the division of labor can reach is limited by the reach of the market. My corollary to that is that the extent of the market is in turn limited by the scope of workable regulation or workable governance that underlies the market. The reason I'm saying this is because markets are not self-standing, self-creating, self-regulating entities. That in order for markets to work well, you need to embed them in a whole range of institutions of regulations and governance. This is a lesson that we've learned in the history of national development that we're now beginning to learn also, or relearn in the case of the global market. Markets don't create get established on their own unless you're talking about a village market or a community market where everybody just can communicate on a face-to-face basis. You need a whole infrastructure of laws and technology and a virtual or real marketplace to be in there. Markets do not regulate themselves when you think about all kinds of externalities, spillovers, incentive problems and asymmetric information that markets are subjected to. That's why all modern economies have almost an alphabet soup of regulatory agencies that look over the market, whether it's the to internalize environmental externalities or to ensure that consumers have enough information about the types of goods that are buying, that businesses and aren't exploiting workers and so forth. Of course, markets aren't self-stabilizing. They don't stabilize on their own. This is a lesson that we've had ever since from John Maynard Keynes, the idea that you need solid monetary and fiscal policy institutions to ensure that economies can generate adequate employment, that you can moderate the business cycle. And ultimately, equally important, I think that markets aren't necessarily self-legitimizing. You need a whole set of other institutions that are going to legitimize the allocation, the outcomes that markets produce. And those are, of course, various institutions of social insurance, institutions of social protection, the welfare state, and ultimately, of course, political democracy too, because that's what give people the sense that they're actually ultimately markets are governed by the decisions of a political community. So that's really the first point, which is to understand that markets work best when they're embedded in these institutions and when the reach of markets go beyond, overreach the boundaries of these institutions, then you're going to run into kinds of problems which I'll come back to. The second key sort of framing analytical point is that when we look around the world today and we say, where are these governance mechanisms located? They're located by and large in the nation state still. We may want to sort of hope and dream that we can have global governance institutions, very well functioning transnational bodies. But the reality is that the main locus of legitimate governance still remains the nation state. I emphasize here legitimate because I think this is where most of democratic politics takes place. This is where democratic deliberation resides. It resides mostly at the level of the nation state. And for a number of reasons that I'll come back to, transnational forms of sort of global governance are likely to remain weak at best, whether it's the World Trade Organization, it's the International Monetary Fund, it's the Group of 20, all these sort of transnational institutions. They're likely to provide at best a very weak infrastructure and therefore for only limited kinds of hyper-globalization. And that's an important limitation. Third, and finally, in terms of framing this overall discussion, different nation states have different ideas about the shape that these governance institutions or these regulatory institutions ought to take. Because different countries, different nation states have had different historical trajectories, they have different cultures, they have different levels of income, they're located in different parts of the world with different kinds of challenges. All that mean is that there are legitimate divergences in the kinds of institutions and patterns of regulation that different countries want. Some countries want a bigger state than others, so they tend to be more regulation heavy than others. Other countries want more social protection, bigger social welfare state than others. Some countries have much more organized labor markets than others. Some want high corporate tax rates, others less. Some want to have much more extensive regulation of financial intermediaries to minimize the risk of financial collapse, even if that means that they are reducing the benefits of financial innovation. Other countries want more financial innovation and therefore are willing to live with financial regulation. These are all legitimate differences. There's the market system doesn't map into a single unique form of institution or governance to underlie them. So we need to understand that there are these differences across countries and that there may be grounded in legitimate differences of democratic electorates and democratic set of stakeholders. If you put all these ideas together, what you get is the view that going forward we have to resign ourselves to a world economy that's going to remain a patchwork in terms of governance. So the idea that we can replicate at the global level or even at the regional level the historical norm where national markets have developed alongside national systems of regulation. In other words, national markets have been embedded in national institutional arrangements, that we're going to regulate that in the regional or global level is basically a pipe dream. It's an outcome that we're unlikely to have. That has a very important implication that it means we need to moderate our ambitions regarding how far we can push economic globalization because the underlying institutional structure has to remain divided along jurisdictional lines. That means that's going to keep imposing costs, transactions costs on international trade and finance associated with economic borders. And when we get the balance between the underlying governance structures and the scope and reach of global markets, then we tend to run one of two kinds of risk. When we are successful in pushing for global rules, for global governance, when most people are actually looking away, as happened in the creation of the World Trade Organization. It was a bunch of essentially trade lawyers and technocrats that created the World Trade Organization, when much of the world's sort of political bodies were looking away. And for economists, this has been a very, the crowning achievement of global governance has been the World Trade Organization. I think it's no surprise that the World Trade Organization also happens to be probably the world's least favorite international organization. It carries a huge legitimacy problem. And that's, I think, the risk that we run when we sort of push a lot of decision making over markets significantly beyond the reach of nation states, when the chain of delegation, so to speak, extends way into the distance, the distance all the way to Geneva and anonymous judges and so forth. The other risk is when we push for global markets without those kinds of global rules, then the other kind of risk that we get is the kind of inefficiency and instability and financial crisis and their spread that we have experienced in the case of financial globalization. The syndromes of financial globalization, the various crises, the instability that we associate with sort of financial market whiplash is in large part the consequence that many of the regulating and stabilizing institutions that exist at the national level don't exist at the global level. So there's no global lender of last resort, there's no global bankruptcy court, there's no global regulator of finance, and that means that both crises can spill over and create contagion, and also we have fewer instruments to deal with their consequences globally than we have nationally. And of course, even nationally, we're struggling, as the last crisis shows, with getting the institutions right. Turning now the argument all the way around, coming full back in some sense, I think recognizing, internalizing these points, that going forward, nation states are likely to remain central as a central part of this architecture, is in fact is something that we shouldn't necessarily feel depressed about. A large part of the book is to actually argue that if we empower nation states as the central agents providing these needed regulatory governance structures to allow markets to exist, then in fact we are going to get a healthier world economy, even if a somewhat less completely globalized world economy, than if we try to actually go the other direction and eviscerate the powers of the nation state through global rules, through global mobility of capital that leaves very little room for domestic policymakers, in the hope of an unattainable kind of a hyper-globalized world economy. Now, it is also the case that as we go forward, there are other factors that are going to sort of make us, the world economy, look much more nation-state centric than many people, and certainly people who want to sort of push for hyper-globalization would like to see. And that's because the balance of global forces, global political forces, is becoming significantly more centrifugal as we go along. We have, of course, that the United States is progressively becoming a smaller part of the world economy. We have the European Union, the second largest power until recently, increasingly likely to become preoccupied with its own internal crises and how to deal with its own internal financial problems. And the rising powers, China and the other middle-income countries, Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey, South Africa, and so forth, are countries that differ in a number of ways, but one thing that they have all in common is that actually they place very high weight on the value of national sovereignty, on the value of non-interference. Much greater weight, in fact, than many of the richer advanced countries. So the conclusion from that is that going forward, the kind of supply of global leadership that we might need, even if we thought that considerably strengthening mechanisms of global governance would be the right thing to do, our ability to achieve that is going to be significantly restrained. And that reinforces the point that I made in the previous slide, that we need to sort of resign ourselves to a world in which the nation state is going to be the primary building block of this institutional architecture, and if so, we need to ensure that the nation state has the room to do this. Now, I said that empowering rather than eviscerating the nation state might be a very good thing rather than a bad thing. So I just want to explain that. Because when I say that we are moving to a world where the nation state, if anything, might become more important or should become more important, this is both an argument about is and also ought. The usual kind of reaction to this is to say, but then don't we really get sort of every country for its own, a kind of spread of beggar thy neighbor policies, a disintegration of sort of individual country policies that imply that sort of this global economic architecture that we built after long decades after the Second World War is going to sort of collapse because of the absence of these mechanisms of global governance, global rules, and so forth. The message I want to give here is that, in fact, this is rather the wrong way of thinking about what supports an open, healthy, functioning world economy. Because the world economy, what is really required to have a healthy world economy is not much more than each individual nation state really following policies that are by and large in their own self-interest. And here, just to make this point very clear, I want to draw a distinction between the global economy and global climate. Because we sometimes think that the global economy is just like global climate. It's what economists call a global commons, which means that somebody has to, we collectively have to look after it. Because if you leave global climate to each individual country, then of course each individual country has an incentive to free ride on the climate control policies of every other country, because after all, everybody shares the same climate. It's no good for just an individual country to invest in curbing greenhouse gases because they all go into the same atmosphere. And so, the global problem of climate change is sort of the epitome of a situation where you really need global governance, if you really need the individual nation states to come together and agree on a collective strategy of curbing greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions. My argument is that you might think that the world economy is sort of the same, that you need countries to come together in order to ensure that we don't collapse into protectionism and centrifugal forces. But in fact, the world economy is different in the sense that when we teach in our economics courses that each country ought to have open trade and finance policies, that it should have open economic borders, that it should have liberal economic policies. Unlike in the climate case, we teach that because we think that it's going to be good in each country's own interest. So open trade policy, specializing according to comparative advantage, is not, we advocate that not because it's supposed to be good for the rest of the world or for your trade partners, it's supposed to be good for you. So for countries to actually follow open economic policies, all they have to do is actually just follow what's essentially good for them. So unlike climate policies, open trade and finance policies are mostly private goods, or actually more accurately semi-private goods. That unlike in the sort of climate change case, you don't necessarily collapse into a problem of the tragedy of the commons if each individual country ends up following their own selfish independent interest. Now, of course, this is an idealized situation, and there are, of course, spillovers from when some country, protects its goods, or some country undervalues its exchange rate. There are, of course, spillovers. There could be adverse spillovers, but in all of these cases, the costs of what one might call political malfunction, the fact that some special interest, some special lobby can overtake the political process and get outcomes that differ or diverge from what would be good for the country's own self-interest, then in those cases it is really going to be the domestic economy that's going to pay the bulk of the costs, not the rest of the world. A very good example of that, of course, is one instance where we think that the democratic, the politics from an economic standpoint malfunctions very badly, is the presence of large agricultural subsidies. Whether it's for sugar or it's for cotton or some other commodities that the United States and other rich countries, the European Union, of course, hugely subsidize agricultural producers. That, of course, has some adverse effects for other agricultural producers elsewhere. So there is the spillover. But the bulk, 95%, if not 98% of the costs are actually borne not by people elsewhere, but they're borne by the domestic consumers in the United States and European Union because they have to pay higher prices, or the domestic taxpayers in the United States and the European Union because they have to finance the subsidies that go to the agriculturalists. So the benefits and costs are, in other words, are mostly contained within the national borders. The conclusion from that is really to see that really the way to deal with these kinds of issues is by trying to improve the political process and the mechanisms of deliberation at home, rather than necessarily to act through external constraints. So the main issue here isn't that countries are using agricultural subsidies or trade protection in order to hurt other countries. They're doing this because a bunch of people in a country are hurting others in the same country. So this is largely an issue that's from within the country that needs to be dealt with by improving the nature of the discussion, including, by the way, by economists making explicit and transparent about what the economic costs of such policies are. But I think the debate that should take is appropriately largely a national one. Of course, taking into account also some of the costs to other countries, particularly if they're poor. When you look at it, when you look at the future of the world economy from this perspective, and you say, okay, how does this change about the way that we deal with some of the key problems that face us? I want to spend maybe just my last 5-10 minutes sort of outlining some ideas about how some of the, what the implications are for key issues. So one, of course, the biggest, overarching idea here is not that, that we shouldn't cooperate globally, that we shouldn't try to get some mechanisms of global governance, that there are indeed spillovers, but that we need to sort of revise our views as to how much political capital needs to be spent on that, and in particular, are emphasizing or putting the weight on where the gains are relatively large, as opposed to the gains from global governance not being all that large. So I want to just give a couple of examples of areas where, in fact, the gains from global governance or improved global governance are significant, as opposed to areas where they may not be so. So the one area where I do think we need much greater global coordination, global understanding, is the so-called area of macro imbalances. What macro imbalances is referring to is the idea that right now China has a very large trade surplus, the United States has a very large trade deficit, and there is a widespread sense that this is at least in part due to the fact that China is following mercantilist policies, in particular is undervaluing its currency, which makes Chinese exports cheap, China's imports expensive for domestic consumers, so China runs a trade surplus. This is costly for the United States and other countries because effectively it is stealing demand from the United States, making it more difficult for countries like the United States to deal with their unemployment problems. I think this is a problem because if these macroeconomic imbalances continue, this is going to be almost certainly a major push for increased protectionism in the United States, that this is going to become politically such a big issue that the result might be much greater push for protection in the United States, precisely the kinds of slippery slope that we may want to avoid. How do we deal with this? I think we need to deal with this understanding that both has to be a way of reducing these macroeconomic imbalances. That in particular means convincing China to allow its exchange rate to appreciate. That's going to be a big part of this. But also understanding, and this is the part that gets very little play in our current discussions, understanding that China also has valid concerns about the domestic employment and social implications of an appreciation of its currency. One of the things that China doesn't want is a large reduction in employment, large reduction in profitability of its many, many factories producing for world markets that might happen if the Chinese currency were to appreciate more rapidly. So in other words, what China needs, if it's going to be convinced of trying to deal with its external imbalance, it needs what I would call an insurance policy, some mechanism whereby it has the policy space, it has the tools to deal with any adverse employment consequences or preventing such social costs. The way to square the two needs is to understand that if the rest of the world is going to ask China to exercise much greater discipline over its macroeconomic and currency policies, that China in turn has to be provided much greater room with which to use its trade and industrial policies, that is its microeconomic policies, if need be, to protect and to prop up any of its export-oriented industries that might come under social strain, under competitive threat as a consequence. So the quid pro quo is to impose discipline where it matters the most in the macroeconomic currency area, but to relieve China of some of the external restraints, for example, that apply under the World Trade Organization's agreement on subsidies, that would significantly constrain the room that China has if it stepped in to prop up some of its failing enterprises through trade and industrial policies that are actually right now constrained by WTO rules. Secondly, this is an important area, which is that this is an area where globalization has actually not gone far enough. So in trade and finance, my concern is mostly with dealing with the consequences of market integration having gone beyond the ability of institutions to deal with them. But there's one area which is the area of migration for work purposes or temporary labor mobility for work purposes, where in fact globalization, market integration hasn't gone nearly far enough. Nearly far enough compared to what? Compared to the magnitude of the gains that actually exist. So the world labor regime today is roughly where the trade regime stood in 1950, which is a world where there are extremely high barriers to the movement of workers. What that means is that the size of barriers are so high that the global economic gains are very large relative to the potential distributional social costs that an increased temporary migration of workers might result in. So my recommendation, what the book describes, is a proposal that would not obviously completely liberalize worker movements around the world, but actually just a relatively small relaxation of existing visa schemes. For example, an increase by about 3% of the rich countries' total labor force. That would yield, one can calculate, net gains that are several times those from any other proposal on the table right now in the Doha round or anything else that the world trade negotiators are actually negotiating in. This is in some sense the unexploited frontier of economic globalization. And it's a very good example of sort of misdirection of political capital in the area of international negotiation and cooperation. There are much more gains on this front than there are with respect to further liberalization in either trade in goods or in financial globalization. With respect to the nature of global rules, I would emphasize the importance of global rules that tend to enhance the quality of domestic deliberation rather than global rules that try to harmonize on substance. So I'm trying to argue for a shift in the mindset of international policymakers that when they meet with their counterparts from other countries, rather than trying to agree on a common set of rules, whether it's financial regulation or it's rules on safety or on labor standards, it's to instead negotiate on how can we ensure that there is some global discipline on not the substance of what each country's democratic policy deliberation will yield, but that democratic deliberation, the quality of it can be enhanced. So the key issues here is, might there be global rules that would enhance the transparency, the accountability, the representativeness, and the use of scientific or other economic evidence in deliberations over regulatory and trade policy domestically. So the idea here is that the rest of the world might have a say in how you design your trade policies or your regulatory policies, to the extent that these the procedures which you use to design those policies are wildly at variance with those that are desirable from a democratic deliberation standpoint. But the rest of the world don't get a say as to what the outcome is, whether you end up with a regulation that might differ from those in the rest of the world. So the point here is to legitimize national differences in regulatory structures, but subject to procedural safeguards that try to ensure higher quality deliberation. This is really one area where I think global governance has a positive contribution to make to the empowerment of nation states. Now, some agreements, for example, in the World Trade Organization already have that flavor. For example, the agreement on phytosanitary standards requires not common standards necessarily, but that when you have a different standard that differs from a global standard, that you used scientific evidence in order to arrive at that policy conclusion. The problem is that in practice, that the interpretation of judges in the WTO dispute settlement procedures sometimes have veered into substance and beyond simply procedural restraints. There are others where, in fact, the most common form of agreement under the World Trade Organization is really when you're not thinking in terms of procedural constraints or procedural safeguards, but it's really just trying to agree on a common set of standards. So this is true with respect to patents, copyrights, it's true with respect to subsidies and so forth. And in many other cases where you have procedural restraints, those procedural restraints happen to be designed very, very badly, and the anti-dumping codes are an example of that. So the idea here is that one can rewrite many of these regulations from a standpoint which is much more concerned with this particular perspective. Where I think the gains aren't significant, where we're still wasting a lot of political capital on, is one after 10 years still our sort of ongoing concern with the Doha round, trying to complete it. It's been completely politically deadlocked. I think the right thing to do is to simply declare victory and walk away from that. There isn't that much, and increasingly many people are coming to that point of view as well. And I think the amount of effort internationally to harmonize financial regulation so that we can have a more perfect financial globalization, I think is largely unwarranted as well. Detracts attention from where the work really needs to be done, which is in creating more sound regulatory procedures at the national level, and also detracts attention from the fact that when you do that work at the national level, many countries will legitimately decide on rules that will be different from those in other countries. And how do you manage that interface is the right worry, is the right kind of question to ask, not the question about how to actually harmonize those differences away. So just to conclude, I sort of the kind of perspective I'm describing for you, I'm describing in this book, is a somewhat different narrative for the world economy. One way to think about it is a set of new traffic rules. It's one that accepts, internalizes the view that in fact that countries have the right to protect their own institutions. That these institutions in which markets are embedded are there for a reason. They might be legitimately different across different countries. So countries do have a right to protect their own social arrangements and institutions in cases where trade and financial flows may undercut them. But they don't have a right to impose them on others. So this right of protecting your own institutions doesn't give you the right to actually impose your corporate governance models, your financial regulation models, your labor standards on other countries. So I think this is a key distinction. From that perspective, therefore, that we can have at best a limited kind of economic globalization, and we need to again understand that the objective of international economic arrangements must be to attain the maximum volume of economic transactions that is consistent with maintaining the space for diversity in national and institutional arrangements. And finally, that key notion here of policy space is the need to ensure that governments, particularly democratic governments, have the policy space that's going to allow them to maintain the kinds of institutions that are important for not only undergirding markets, but also to re-erect the social compacts, which were very important for the legitimization of markets and the world economy. To allow poor nations, I haven't talked much about the challenges that developing countries face, but policy space is equally important for them because as countries like China and India and many others have shown, it's only countries that are able to design their domestic industrialization, their domestic economic restructuring policies that are able to leverage the world economy as a consequence. So just simply opening up to the world markets, the world economy doesn't do the job. That's the lesson of history. And finally, of course, this acceptance of policy space and the acceptance of space for diversity is ultimately is rooted in the desire to create, to allow all nations to create the kinds of financial systems and regulatory structures that are much more attuned to their own conditions and needs. And I've just argued for you, this is not necessarily a recipe for a collapse of the world economy. In fact, we're more likely to get a healthy world economy as a result than compared to what we would get if we ignore or neglect these lessons. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions and comments. Thank you.
If you go to Singapore, they will say, we have classical democracy, not liberal democracy, but we have excellent governance. If you go to Jamaica, they will say just the opposite. Likewise, Mexico and Chile. And I was wondering whether you've had a chance to do any comparison, let's say, of China and India in this regard.
By governance, I mean the rule structure. And of course, the rule structure can be designed through democratic mechanism, so it can be designed through some, top-down method. And the rule structure can be appropriate, it can be inappropriate. India, by the way, is very interesting as a very poor, low-income country. We think that, that Indian democracy functions very, very badly. But the question is compared to what? And I think actually the Indian democracy has worked very well for a country that is so divided, so poor, faces so many challenges. And I would guess that if India had not managed to maintain its democracy, that it may not have held together ultimately as a stable political entity for so long, despite all the problems. So my reading of the evidence is that even if you don't care about the intrinsic value of democracies, free speech, ability to choose who rules over you and so forth, that ultimately that you are likely to get better governance on average, but don't count on it. That's not the point. But that if we want to sort of say, okay, what kind of governance we want to say, I would always choose democratic governance rather than the other, because I think we're, again, that there's no guarantee that your authoritarian ruler is going to be Lee Kuan Yew. You might as well get Mobutu, and that's a big risk. So on the whole, it's much less risky to be living under democracy, is what I would say.
I'm a social psychologist by trade, okay? I am thrilled to hear you talking about backing away from Milton Friedman's worldwide flat, everything take all Wild West economics. That's great. And you're saying it's coming back into a nation state mode and giving regulation authority. That's great. What concerns me is I see the current trend to actually slide right back through nation states. And as we're looking at all the news things, you got Eastern Libya, Western Libya, 2 separate republics. You might land up with 500 East Timors. And that's what it looks like to me. And that's exactly where we're going. Yeah. And how do we do that? How do we work this when there's really almost nobody to deal with?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I don't deal in this book with weak states, failed states, artificial states, and states that are unlikely to sort of last together as single states. But this is a huge, huge issue. So I don't think there is, there are nation states that have proved their durability, and we know they're going to be around for a while. So large proportion, or in fact all relatively wealthy, relatively well functioning countries in the world have that property. But there are many, and a lot of them are in Africa, who aren't that properties. Sudan just split up, right? Now there's a southern Sudan, and there was nothing that sort of predictable or stable about Sudan as a single country staying together. So unless the whole notion of global governance too is based that the constituent units are going to be well-governed individual units. So when you don't have individual well-governed units, there's nothing you can do with an alternative model either. So those countries aren't going to be parts of a well-functioning, hyper-globalized, hyper-globally governed world economy either. So for them, really, it's just there's domestic work to be done before they can join the world economy.
You're right to focus on China. We have these absolutely gross, egregious imbalances with them. $700 million a day trade deficit with China. And we've got meetings coming up, as you know, Monday and Tuesday of next week here in Washington, the third version of these high-level bilateral discussions with China, where we continue to discuss all of these points, of course, currency, the need for them to grow by more domestic demand, and all these things. And I mean, I don't have a good crystal ball here, but I wouldn't mind placing a bet that we're probably not going to break through next week when we haven't for a long time. So I guess my question is that if you look at it from a more practitioner's perspective, what are the actual arguments that can be made across that table next week to the Chinese to explain to them that what we're faced with here is a completely unstable form of globalization.
Part of the problem here is that the United States hasn't shown that it also has an appreciation of the problem that China faces here. In other words, there is a significant and not misplaced worry in China that if the country doesn't keep growing at the usually, the number that is usually mentioned in this connection is 8%, that the country doesn't generate enough employment, the country has then to face a lot of social strife. And we've talked about governance models. And one thing that China is very bad at, precisely because it doesn't have political democracy, is very bad at dealing with domestic social strife. So the bargain that the Chinese leadership has made with its sort of domestic people is, we are going to generate very high growth year after year, and you are not going to complain. And I think they are reasonably worried that the following chain of events is one that you cannot dismiss out of hand, that a rapid appreciation of the renminbi brings a lot of the export-oriented firms, industrial firms, under pressure, squeezes their profits, and forces them to lay off workers. At that point, in other words, we know that their undervalued currency has been a significant boost to their growth in their last 10 years. So if you just run that story in reverse, ask what will happen if you now start to remove that undervaluation of the currency, it's quite predictable, or at least it's not implausible, that they will, my own calculation is that if you try to, it's not implausible that removing a 25% undervaluation of the currency may easily shave off a couple of percentage points of their growth rate, which may easily get them below the 8% threshold. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if they are sticking with this policy, it's because they're really concerned about the domestic implications of this. Now, what does that imply for this kind of debate? What it means is that you have to give them something if you want them to, what I've called here an insurance policy. So if they're going to be willing to agree to a more rapid appreciation of the currency, and if it turns out that their plants, their manufacturers, they are coming under severe pressure under certain sectors, right? Do they have the kinds of policy instruments that they can deploy, not the exchange rate, but can they subsidize, can they provide tax incentives, can they occasionally put some trade restrictions on certain, just as an insurance to deal with some of the employment consequences if and where they are felt. Currently, because of the WTO rules, they don't have the policy flexibility to necessarily rely on these trade and industrial policies to protect employment. And therefore, they are in a bind too. So the quid pro quo I'm suggesting here, which is if you want China to appreciate the currency more rapidly, let them know that you're not going to pursue cases against them in the World Trade Organization if and when they have to apply trade and industrial policies and insurance mechanism to prop up employment, if it turns out that this appreciation has adverse sectoral implications.
It's not only the currency manipulation, there is also the industrial policy, the subsidization, the no environmental standards, no labor standards, many of these things. I don't see how that works, how that's a stable negotiation.
Let me tell you the story in China. Before 2001, before China entered the World Trade Organization, its currency wasn't undervalued. It didn't have large external imbalances. It wasn't that China wasn't supporting its industries, but it was supporting its industries through sectoral policies, through trade and industrial policies, that didn't, in aggregate, produce a trade surplus. Once it enters the World Trade Organization, it significantly reduces reliance on those kinds of policies. You might still think it has a lot, but China's tariffs have come down significantly. They're now in single digits. Chinese industrial policy has significantly been reduced. They came back up a little bit during the crisis, but compared to the 1990s, they've completely been reduced significantly. So the point is that they in fact shifted to exchange rate protection in part because they couldn't use sectoral policies. The problem with exchange rate protection, however, is that by definition it spills over to the external balance. So if you want to, the only way out here is where you can simultaneously improve the bilateral macroeconomic imbalance, but also allow China to prop up certain industries as an insurance mechanism, is to say that, okay, you can't do everything on the exchange rate, but you can do a little bit more on the sectoral policy. So economically, this is the right approach to this.
In terms of assessing the prospects for the world economy in the context of your analysis, could you please comment on the following 5 factors? Number 1, population growth. The world population is expected to grow from nearly $7 billion to $9 billion in 2050. Scarcity of resources is manifested by the recent surge in oil and food prices. Ecology, the changing ecology with global warming, growing frequency of floods, earthquakes, droughts, and so on. Debt, the explosive debt, especially in the growing excessive debt formation in the Western world. And finally, the Arab Spring, what does it all mean, the uprising in the Arab world? Thank you.
We would have, predicted on the basis of many of these same kinds of challenges that things could have done really badly in the last 30 years. But if you look at what has happened in the last 30 years, it has actually been a pretty, despite the crisis and various sort of financial crises and everything, it's been a pretty good 30 years. Now, the big unknown, of course, and this is where I think the biggest challenge of global governance is the whole climate change issue. This is where, clearly, I don't say much about this in the book, but it's the solution is rather obvious, and I think that's and that's where I think mankind is really being tested the most, is whether we can achieve a global climate change treaty that's going to put on a lower path of emissions. That's the big issue. I don't think that with respect to natural resources, there's a real fundamental limit. I mean, this is again sort of, I think there's a sense in which, we think that there's sort of this, quantity, sort of ceiling. I think these are things over which, technology is going to be our friend there. We'll have substitutes, and will a combination of substitutes with reducing the resource intensity of economic growth. I think that's going to be the solution. I'm much more optimistic there. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.